Know what your teacher forgot to tell you about the bad old Puritans? About pilgrims and log cabins? And pilgrims and religious freedom? And what about good old Plymouth Rock? Oh, what you don't know.
In 1620, a hardy band of pilgrims left behind the tyranny and oppression of a distant West in search of liberty in a new world. They landed on Plymouth Rock and then built a log cabin community based on the principle that all men should be free to practice their religion any way they choose.
Okay, I know that's how we all heard it, but none of it's true. The Pilgrims didn't land on Plymouth Rock. They didn't land in Plymouth at first to begin with anyway. They didn't live in log cabins. They didn't go around wearing those funny black outfits and kooky hats. We've been had. To get to the bottom of this Pilgrim scam, we decided to start with Plymouth Rock.
What is this? What is this, John? It's the first rock.
Well, you know, I wish I could actually touch it so I could say I touched the rock.
If you're patriotic, you appreciate it.
The first thing you notice about Plymouth Rock is that it's surrounded by a huge Greek-like temple. Look at this thing. It's made out of Quincy granite or something. Anyway, under any other circumstances, this would seem ridiculous. A rock surrounded by its own temple. But of course, this is Plymouth Rock. It's to the Americans what the Eiffel Tower is to the French, what the Leaning Tower of Pisa is to the Italians. It's our sacred national shrine. It's America. Indeed, the rock is so important to us that pilgrims visit the place night and day, every night and day, 365 days a year. Even presidents visit. When they put up the temple in the 1920s, President Warren Harding came up from Washington to join in the celebration.
When I was a kid, there was no portico. The rock was just here.
The portico has been here since 1920. This was constructed.
Well, maybe it was
in
open then, but I remember walking on the rock.
Indeed, you might very well have, because there was more shoreline here, and there wasn't the railing here.
Yeah.
Look it, we have a bird on the rock.
And here's what all the fuss is about. Yes, this is it, Plymouth Rock.
We came all the way from Hollywood, Florida to see this rock, and it's not big enough.
But I can see why the Pilgrims landed here, because there's all this money around here. I'd stop here too. They had to stop somewhere. You know, they're running out of water here. There's nothing much further to go. You know, you always hear stories. You think it's some kind of cliff, some kind of mountain, and like something really enormous. But you get here and, yep, it's just a rock.
There it is.
And that's just the beginning of the disappointment. It turns out we built this huge monument, this huge temple, to a rock that may be no more significant than any other old rock. I know the Park Service people here give you a different story.
A man in the bow spied a rock that jutted out into the sea.
But according to historian George Willison, who wrote this book, Saints and Strangers, back in 1945, and who spent his whole life studying the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock, the whole story is just malarkey. A folk story turned into a money-making tourist attraction. What Willison found out is that the Plymouth Rock legend rests almost entirely on the dubious testimony of a 95-year-old man who told the story more than a century after the Mayflower landed. The man was Elder Thomas Faunce, the year 1741, and it happened while Faunce was down on the beach with some friends.
My father told me the story about the old comers' arrival in the New World, and he told me they landed on this rock right here.
Well, you never told us this before.
You know, well, let's go.
Like most historians, James Baker agrees with Willison that it's all a myth. Do you buy the story?
No, I think Elder Faunce is... Well, what is Elder Faunce, when he's 95 years old, is carried down, and he says that's where the forefathers landed. pointing at the rock. It might be a place, therefore, that was near there. That was a marker for his own mind. But they didn't specifically say, perhaps, they actually stepped on the rock. But that was a marker roughly where he said they landed. And of course, this is 121 years after the event.
And of course, there's even more disappointment. This isn't even where the rock was located when the Pilgrims landed. It's been moved.
1620, Plymouth Rock.
Plymouth Rock looks like it's always been just where it is now. But townsfolk repeatedly moved it, initially to help inspire patriots on the eve of the Revolution. And this is where things get comical. Over the years, the rock was moved so many times it started breaking into pieces. At one point, there were 2 Plymouth Rocks. The half that broke off on the beach, and the other half they'd moved into the center of town. Then they lost the half on the beach, until it turned up as a doorstep to an old warehouse. Eventually, of course, they decided to have just 1 Plymouth Rock because it was too confusing having 2. So they glued them together. It was a good repair job, but the rock still doesn't look the way it used to. It used to be bigger. As the rock became more and more famous, people started breaking off huge chunks for souvenirs. They've got a chunk of the rock in Plymouth Pilgrim Hall. Here it is. It's stashed in the basement, right next to the men's room. 200 miles away, we found another hunk of the rock at Vassar College. See that doorway? That's it right there. They just put a hunk of the rock up there. And then we found yet another chunk of the rock across the country, in Seattle of all places, embedded in this monument to the pioneers of the Northwest.
It's just one rock.
Yep.
It's just the one rock.
Yep.
And this is where the Pilgrim, this is where it all started, is that it?
Just between you and me, I like the story of Plymouth Rock. To paraphrase Warren Harding, I love the story of Plymouth Rock, whether it's true or not. It's a great story.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I might want to jump in and hug it.
Okay, so they didn't land on the rock. The rock's been moved. But they were the first Europeans to land in what became the United States, right? Absolutely. 100%. You bet. Wrong. Remember Jamestown? Jamestown was settled in 1607, years before the Pilgrims ever got to Plymouth. And Jamestown wasn't even first. Before Jamestown, there was St. Augustine, Florida. And before that, there was a place in South Carolina settled by slaves after their masters were run off by Indians. And before that, there were places out west settled by the Spanish. So what in the world is going on here? Why do we hear so much about the Pilgrims? It's because of pride. The first historians to write the history of the United States happened to be from New England. So naturally, they gave the Pilgrims, New Englanders, a lot of attention. So much attention, everybody kind of forgot all about the others who were here before the Pilgrims. Okay, so they didn't land on the rock. The rock's been moved, and they weren't even the first Europeans to land in the New World. But they did land in Plymouth. Sure, they landed in Plymouth, but they didn't land here first. The first place they went to was Provincetown, on the tip of Cape Cod.
Hi, good morning, folks. On behalf of Captain John Boats, we'd like to welcome you aboard the Cape Cod Clipper for our daily trip over to Provincetown at the very tip of Cape Cod.
So where exactly did the Pilgrims land first? We went to Provincetown to find out.
As we pull away from the Mayflower 2 State Pier, you're going to get a nice look straight down the stern of the Mayflower 2, the replica of the Pilgrim ship.
When we arrived in Provincetown, we immediately set out to find the spot where the Pilgrims really landed. But this wasn't Plymouth. Our search wouldn't be easy. Do you know where the Pilgrims landed?
In Plymouth.
If it's not Plymouth, I have no idea.
The first time?
Plymouth?
Maybe it's Provincetown.
Provincetown.
It landed. I'll put Provincetown in.
It was in this nearly deserted place that we finally found what we were looking for. This is it. This is the place the Pilgrims first landed, in Provincetown, November 11th, 1620. Here's a little marker they've got. This is it. Now you know.
I remember as a child looking for it in the history books and never finding even a mention of Provincetown. And it was very confusing because we were told that they landed here first, yet we could never find it documented. Now I just think it stinks.
So what in the world is going on here? We think that the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth first, but they didn't. We think that the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, but they didn't. How did we get all this so wrong? What, did Plymouth just have a good press agent? And just why are the Pilgrims so special? How'd they get into the national mythology? Well, the main reason is after the Revolution we needed heroes, and the Pilgrims were available. Americans didn't want their kids growing up on English legends like Robin Hood and such. So writers after the war started to churn out new American legends. The Pilgrims kind of fit right in. I do have to tell you that up to this point hardly anybody had paid attention to Plymouth's Pilgrims, except the people of Plymouth. And even they'd kind of neglected them. Townsfolk used to run their horses through the Pilgrim graveyard, even used their headstones as sewer covers. But that didn't matter. Still with me? All right, it's time to visit the Mayflower. Not the real Mayflower, of course, the Mayflower II, a replica of the ship that brought the Pilgrims to America. As the replica shows, the Mayflower looked about the way most of us would imagine it did. But be careful how you imagine things went. First, most of the people on the ship weren't religious. Sorry to tell you this, but only about a third were pious pilgrims. The rest were either servants or adventurers, out for gold and cod and glory. Second, and I know this is going to shock you, the pious pilgrims did not come to America in search of religious freedom. Historian Francis Jennings.
Well, they came for no such purpose. They came over to find freedom for their own worship and suppression of everything else.
While the Pilgrims had been persecuted in England, they'd since fled to Holland, where they'd enjoyed perfect religious freedom for about a dozen years. The problem was Holland was too free. The Pilgrims worried their children might be tempted to follow the religious views held by others.
To the Pilgrims, tolerance is a bad thing. It means you don't firmly believe in your own truth enough to try to convince everybody.
Don't feel badly that we believe the Pilgrims came over for religious freedom. It's a myth. But what is a myth? It's something that tells us who we are and what values we cherish. Just remember, it is a myth. That I have debunked about every Pilgrim myth imaginable. Hang on, there's more.
Welcome to Plymouth Plantation. In the Pilgrim Village, you will encounter people portraying residents of the community built by the Pilgrims over 350 years ago. In their midst, you will become odd-looking visitors from another world.
This is how the Pilgrims lived in the 1600s, as recreated by the staff of Plymouth Plantation, one of those living history museums where you can walk around and touch things, and one of the very best in the whole country. Notice anything peculiar? Nowhere at Plymouth Plantation can you find Pilgrims living in a log cabin, though Hollywood always put them in one.
A log cabin? What is that? Fell trees and stack them on top of one another, mean you? That'd be a troublesome labour, don't you think?
Log cabins, it turns out, didn't arrive in America until the end of the century.
You want a house that you recognize as being nice. The carpenters had never made a log cabin. They couldn't conceive of it. And therefore they wouldn't have thought to do it.
Okay, no log cabin. What else? No Pilgrims wearing those familiar black get-ups.
I am not overclad.
Some people might have worn black clothes like people wear today, but it wasn't the style that they felt was absolutely necessary they have.
So they wore reds, greens...
Anything you could get from a dye of the period, yes.
The Pilgrims not only aren't dressed in black, they aren't wearing those funny belt buckles or black steeple hats or weird shoes.
A pilgrim with buckles on their shoes.
So what in the world is going on here? Why do we get the Pilgrims so wrong in so many ways? Well, it's because of the Victorians. We get our idea of what the Pilgrims were like from them, and they made the Pilgrims over in their own image.
We're not looking at what the people actually wore back then, but what people who did the artwork of the late 19th century thought should be the case. Now, if you take the late 19th century, what is a respectable dress? I mean, the Pilgrims are real respectable. Well, you wear a black suit, and you wear a little bit of white linen at your cuffs. In other words, it's Victorian respectability made back to the Pilgrims.
And why the buckles on the shoes and belts?
No, I'm not certain why you would need a buckle on a hat.
A buckle in the 19th century was more or less to denote quaintness and old-fashioned. Pilgrims got buckles all over.
They're old-fashioned. We'll put a buckle on them.
They're quaint. But think of Santa Claus. He has one of those buckles, right? And he has that kind of coat. Or, for that matter, leprechauns have those buckles. I mean, they're like mythical creatures, like Santa Claus, Pilgrims, leprechaun, all the same thing.
Okay, we've done the Pilgrims in everything, right? We've done the Pilgrims in their shoes, we've done the Pilgrims in their hats, we've done the Pilgrims in their clothes, we've done the Pilgrims in the log cabins, we've done the Pilgrims and... Wait, there's one thing we haven't done. The Pilgrims and the Indians. What about that? As you might imagine, we get this story wrong, too. They do have Indians at Plymouth Plantation, but I'm afraid they don't tell the story of the Indians the way they should. Almost no one ever does. It's almost too painful.
Now, as the herring fish will rot, it will enrich the seed of what you've planted, making the yield of your Indian corn harvest that much more grand. Now, Squanto, the Indiana, he was the one that taught us this.
But there's more to his story than that he showed the Pilgrims how to plant corn. Squanto was available to help the Pilgrims only because his own people had been wiped out by an epidemic that killed up to 95% of the Indians living along the New England seacoast.
The Black Death killed a third of Europe. This killed 90 to 95%. Of whom? Well, of the Indians. We don't know what the plague is. Some people think it was smallpox, but I think it was probably the plague itself, bubonic plague.
Unfortunately, at Plymouth Plantation, they don't make a big deal about the epidemic, though they do grimly show how the Pilgrims explained it away.
Many of those that died were of tribes that plotted against us 4 years ago, and I imagine perhaps this is the reason why God has seen fit to punish them, that they would dare raise their hand against us, his people.
They viewed themselves as children of God, and so what they did, they had God on their side.
At Plymouth Plantation, the Indians and whites live happily together like one big family. But the story is not quite as romantic as it seems. They don't tell you this in history class, but a few days after the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth, they robbed the Indians' graves.
They found 2 or 3 bags of corn. In all, they ended up with 10 bushels of corn, and they say, this will be enough for our next planting. I think my take on that would be, they did try to make restitution for that later.
The people of Plymouth, in fact, got along better with the Indians than many of their neighbors did. For some 40 years, Indians and whites lived in peace. But if you read the small print at Plymouth Plantation, you find out that in the end they did come into conflict. The people of Plymouth sold Indian children as slaves and illegally purchased Indian lands, helping spark the worst war in colonial New England history, King Philip's War, which decimated the Indian tribes from Maine to New York. But you do have to read the small print. So the biggest myth of all about the Pilgrims is that they are the same group as the Puritans. Well, actually, they're not. Fact is, both groups detested each other. The Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower in 1620 and founded the Plymouth colony. The Puritans came over on the Arabella in 1630 and founded the Massachusetts Bay colony at Salem. Both groups included religious reformers who wanted to purify the Church of England, but they took different approaches. This is why they disliked each other so. The Plymouth reformers hated the Church of England and wanted to separate from it. That's why you sometimes hear them being referred to as separatists. They were hardcore. The Massachusetts Bay reformers, the Puritans, didn't want to separate from the church, just wanted to put an ocean between them. Just like the Pilgrims, the Puritans have their own living history museum, Salem 1630, Pioneer Village. To help clear up the confusion about them, we decided to take you there. The first thing you see upon entering the village is the pillory. It seems like a bad joke that they let the kids play around it like a jungle gym, except that in a way it fits. The Puritans weren't grim and harsh the way we think they were.
Well, that's enough of that. See you later.
Their humorlessness, of course, is legendary.
Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. Writer H.L. Mencken.
The Puritan hated bear baiting, not because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectator. Historian Thomas V. Macaulay.
But even the Puritans approved of having fun.
And you might expect some kids to be playing with their toys, maybe doing their chores here as well. Puritans certainly not afraid to have fun. In fact, the children were skipping rope on the Arabella on the way over here, and they were having fun.
They didn't even dress grim and dreary as we think they did. Actually, given the harsh living conditions at Salem, the Puritans had every right to feel grim. In the early years, they lived in hovels like this, 10 to a room. Later, they graduated to houses with thatched roofs. It was enough to drive anyone to drink, and did.
They chose this place close to supply of fresh water. But drinking is not as straightforward as you might assume. They'd much prefer to drink alcohol. Puritans did drink quite considerable sums by our standards, certainly not afraid of drinking by any means.
Confused about the Puritans now? Well, you ought to be. You've been brainwashed so long, the truth sounds wrong. But historians say they get things pretty much right here at Salem 1630. Except for one thing, the Puritans and the Indians. To listen to village historian Dean Lampros, there's really no reason to talk a lot about the Indians.
Here in Massachusetts and in New England, by the time the settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Company arrived, there weren't many natives left in this area.
The Puritans, they didn't treat the Indians badly. No, not at all. Not too much later, at least.
There was plenty of land here for the early settlers, and it was only later when they began pushing west and the frontier began expanding, that's when you began to have conflicts.
The truth of the matter is such that it would disgrace any moralizing person. They came over with the intention, right from the beginning, of taking over.
Fighting actually broke out between the Indians and the Puritans quite early on, in 1637, in what was called the Pequot War. The darkest moment of the war came when the Puritans deliberately burned down an entire Indian village, killing maybe 500, 600, 700 people.
It is a mean and ugly story.
They basically burned them out. They had them surrounded, mostly women and children, and shot them as they came out, killing hundreds in this one battle. You can't really even call it a battle, really. It was a slaughter.
That's shocking stuff, but you don't hear anything about it at Salem 1630. Why is that? Well, it's in the nature of places like that to be positive and upbeat. You go to the Puritan village and you're made to feel good about the Puritans. You go to the Pilgrim village and you're made to feel good about the Pilgrims. In reality, there's plenty of reason to feel ashamed about both Pilgrims and Puritans. Remember the Pequot slaughter? It was perpetrated by the Puritans, but it was approved by the Pilgrims.
It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, but the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice. Pilgrim Governor William Bradford.
A lot of the things I've told you about today are unbelievable. I know that. It's because life is unbelievable. And as a good friend of mine likes to say, it's unbelievable because, well, people are crazy and do darn fool things. It's what makes history interesting. And that's no myth. I'm Rick Shenkman.